There's no one game that's been recommended for me to try more often than Landstalker for the Sega Genesis. It has all of the ingredients that I really enjoy in my games, like RPG elements, neat armor and weapons to find, tons of exploration and secrets, and to top it all off, it's isometric. What more could I possibly ask for? Well, this game doesn't exactly get you all hyped up to play like some others do. Landstalker has one of the most unexciting title sequences I think I've ever seen. There's no demo screen to show you the ropes, no beautiful song to draw you into the setting, and instead it has a grand total of 3 seconds of ominous notes as the title splashes across the screen before it goes silent. Getting a small introduction to game mechanics or some kind of roll call of characters you'll meet is pretty typical for longer form games, so having absolutely nothing other than a cool logo felt a little bit out of place. Where the game does excel is after you select New Game and have the pleasure of viewing a fully fleshed out introductory sequence. The manual encourages players to watch this carefully to figure out how to bypass obstacles, but I thought that this was a little bit backwards. You don't actually get to any of the more complex puzzling or platforming until much later in the game, at least not the kind of stuff they're showing here. And it's also a little cruel that you can only see this one time at the very beginning of your playthrough, when you have no context for how everything actually controls or feels. It's not like Solstice where you can sit on the title screen and watch a couple of different scenarios to get some ideas flowing for when you finally do gain control. It's this one time and then never again. Either way though, the introduction is very well done and sets up the story quite nicely. You play as a forest elf named Nigel, an adventurer who learns of the legendary treasure of King Nole. In a chance happening, he crosses paths with a wood nymph named Friday who claims to know of its whereabouts, and together they go off to find it. There's a rival group with a leader named Kayla that's also trying to track down King Nole's stash and wants to capture Friday to squeeze her for information about it. But I really found these characters and this story in general to be a blip on the fun factor scale. Exposition is doled out every so often when you complete something important, but I really didn't enjoy all the characters that much. A lot of their bantering and posturing felt extremely trivial, feeling almost tacked on as if to say there was a story so that the game had some kind of structure. There was never really much of a threat from Kayla and her crew, or any of the other characters you meet along the way for that matter. And because of how superficial the narrative feels, there's very little here to develop any of these people beyond the bare minimum, which in turn made it impossible for me to really care about any of them. While I don't necessarily need my characters deeply fleshed out to get the most out of a game, what was provided here actually made me dislike most of them. Nigel's completely motivated by greed, Friday's motivated by her crush on Nigel, and everyone around them have personalities as shallow as a puddle. I didn't want to root for Nigel and Friday because they both seemed so bossy and miserable. Even in a game like Potful Mail, where Potful's also ridiculously greedy, she's at least multidimensional and has a heart when it counts. I'm pretty sure that behind Nigel's permasmile is a ruthless monster that would do anything for gold, and I just couldn't get behind that. I think the biggest hurdle for me were the controls. I absolutely adore isometric games, and I've played a lot of them growing up. Because of that, I can usually step into almost any isometric platformer and not really struggle too much with the basics of getting around. But Landstalker's controls were a different story altogether. For those of you that may not have played a game like this before, you usually move in 4 directions using the D-pad, and you can freely turn between them by pressing a different direction than what you're facing. It's as intuitive as playing a top-down action game, and some people even turn their controllers 45 degrees to match the orientation of the character on screen so they can wrap their heads around it better. In Landstalker though, there's an extra layer here to complicate things. Once you've committed to moving either up or down, or left and right, all directions on the D-pad move you those ways. The first time this happened, I thought my controller was bugging out because I'd never experienced something quite like that before. In order to turn Nigel 90 degrees, you have to press a diagonal, and only then can you change the way he's facing. I realize this might not make much sense if you're not the one holding the controller, but I think the best way to think about it is that you have to do an additional action to turn before you can move in a different direction, which goes against nearly all conventions for this kind of video game. In the very earliest parts of the quest, I grappled with this a lot, and it usually translated into disaster for me. I constantly made stupid mistakes, like walking into enemies while attacking when I didn't mean to, not to mention the difficulty I had adapting to their counterattacks. I also consistently fell off platforms while trying to turn myself, since there simply wasn't enough room to maneuver sometimes. If this sounds miserable, it was for a while, but I eventually overcame the conundrum. I mastered the jump turn for those tight spaces, and once I got into the flow of combat, everything started to click for me. I will say that it took a lot of practice to unlearn how I normally move in these games, but it was totally worth the effort for how much I ended up enjoying Landstalker after I got the hang of it all. If rumors of bad controls are the only thing keeping you from trying this out for yourself, you might be happy to know that there are a couple of patches that restore a more traditional control scheme without all of the diagonal nonsense. Unfortunately for me though, there was nothing built into the original cartridge to get around the problem. Along the way to King Nole's treasure hideout, you'll find yourself traveling this vast land across large coniferous forests, through swamps and caves, and a lot of towns too. I actually really love how everything looks in Landstalker. The colors in the outdoor spaces feel true to life, and I could almost smell the piney forest air and hear the water trickling down the rivers and creeks. Lots of the stage design took advantage of the isometric perspective to weave in some challenge and interest while traipsing along. There's some tricky platforming required to reach some high ledges, as well as many spots where you can duck out of sight behind some trees or walls to look for secrets. All I can say is that you should make sure to keep your eyes peeled at all times, because there's lots to take in, as well as a few great reasons to backtrack to previous areas once you gain access to new abilities. I also loved the character pixel art. Some of the townspeople were straight up recycled on occasion, but I really liked the variety in the clothing choices in the different regions. Each town has its own unique style and features, and along with the character garb, they achieved some really satisfying cohesion. If I had to pick one thing that stood out the most about people's outfits though, it was their footwear, especially Nigel's. His boots are prominently featured in the manual's artwork, but nothing really compares to how in your face they are on screen at all times. It's not even as if his boots are a focal point in the story or have any special role apart from being a normal part of the equipment list. They're just drawn huge for the sake of being huge. The funniest part is that even though most people would be tripping over feet that large, Nigel's walk cycle is one of the smoothest I've ever seen, maybe only second to the protagonist in Crusader of Senti. Another notable aspect of the visuals were the building's interiors. Many of the houses had appealingly decorated furniture and at least one bed that I incessantly jumped on. There were usually a lot of cool doodads hung up on the walls to look at as well, which made these spaces feel like someone actually lived there, versus the cookie-cutter generic homes in other adventures. I think it only happened once or twice the whole time I was playing, but the game made the mistake of letting me pick up and take something from someone's house. After that, I rampaged through every town hoping to find other goodies to pilfer, but I was consistently let down. I don't need every place I barge into to be rife for the rummaging, but it is nice when those efforts pay off once in a while, especially when the game teaches you that it's possible. Unfortunately though, most of the stuff you can take has been conveniently placed inside of a chest, but that still didn't stop me from looking anyway. Another great feature here is that most buildings had someone around to talk to. The non-playable characters did a lot more than just giving quest directives for once. I was actually surprised at how much they wanted to fill me in about the drama of the day, or ramble on about life around town. I wouldn't say they're as fleshed out as they are in other titles, but there were plenty of reasons to strike up a conversation, and I rarely passed up the chance to chat with everyone I could. I enjoy getting as immersed as possible in a game's world, and Landstalker's NPCs made that easy. The towns also provided the usual places you might expect, like inns to recover at, as well as shops to purchase items and equipment. I have to say that buying things was a little strange. To make a purchase, you have to pick up the item you want, walk it over to the cashier, and then throw it at them to initiate the transaction. What's incredibly inconvenient is if you want to buy more than one of something. Because it disappears after you buy it the first time, you have to leave the store and re-enter so it'll respawn to purchase it again. Later on in the game, when I was rolling in cash and had a fairly big life meter to refill on the go, I wanted to max out how many e-geeks I was carrying. These auto-revive Nigel with a little health cushion after dying in the throes of battle, and were pretty cheap considering how powerful they are. I never thought I'd say this, but thankfully, stacks of items in your inventory cap out at 9, so I didn't have to wear a hole in the shop floor walking in and out to buy 99 of them. I should also mention, for those of you that don't like to open your wallets unless you have to, there are lots of deals to be found if you look for them. Different stores across the world vary their pricing, so it's worth writing down where the cheap stuff is if you don't mind hiking back to previous areas. Other than the tedious single item at a time purchase system, there was one other aspect to shopping that kinda irked me. It wasn't always clear what was actually for sale. There was one part of the game where an armor upgrade was sitting out on a counter, but it was away from all of the other stuff to buy in the shop. I never even noticed it and spent a pretty long time in weaker equipment getting my butt handed to me in combat. While I loved the charming look of a busy store, for function's sake, I wish that things would have been a bit more organized. A big part of my fumble here was that I was also finding new equipment while out exploring, and I hadn't seen new stuff to buy up to that point. I wasn't actively looking for that sort of thing in shops to begin with. But with that said, I also wasn't expecting to have to engage in a hidden objects puzzle just to see a new chest plate sitting there. Hopefully knowing this will help some of you avoid my mistake. On the topic of equipment, I enjoyed how slipping on a new chest plate altered portions of Nigel's sprite's color scheme. It wasn't amazingly transformative or anything, but it was nice to occasionally have something different to look at. Now, I did find it a little tricky to understand what equipment upgrades in Landstalker actually did. The convention in games with a single inventory screen is that things further to the right are usually more powerful than the stuff on the left. As I expected, equipment I found later on usually slotted in to the right of things I had in my inventory already, but there was no indication of how much stronger something was, if it was even stronger at all. The names weren't really much help either. Most of the swords are tied to an elemental magic attack, and the chest plates and boots aren't named in any obvious way that they could be ranked. The manual's also incredibly vague and doesn't bother quantifying anything at all for the player. I really thrive in games that provide equipment information in some form, like the instruction booklet or in stores when you buy them. So the fact that this was missing completely made me wonder why these details didn't make it into the game. The only thing you can really do to try to quantify a few things is to go out and find an enemy and see how many hits it takes to kill them with each of the swords, or try to measure how many HP you're bleeding whenever you get hit wearing different armor. At the very least, I would have been happy with a character stat screen to see how all the numbers change when you put on new items, but unfortunately, even that was missing as well. There was a curious thing that I noticed while playing through Landstalker that I didn't completely understand. Life stocks are listed in the manual as items that increase your health gauges total every time you pick one up. And while that's definitely true, I also observed that over time, the more life stocks I collected, the stronger Nigel's strength seemed to get. The number of hits it took to kill the same kinds of enemies decreased well before I'd find a new sword. There's no leveling or experience system here, nor are there any other ways that I know of that could have made this possible. The only thing that was changing was my livestock hoard that ticked ever upwards as I was rewarded for exploring or reaching a new town with a shop that sold one. The description for the Gaia statue in the manual does say that its offensive powers are increased as Nigel's health bar increases, so I don't think it's too much of a stretch that other attacks might also improve this way as well. If you know how this all works, I'd love to hear the ins and outs in the comments because it was never clear to me while playing. I found the combat in Landstalker to be fairly mediocre. First off, until much later in the game when you can start making use of some distance attacks, almost all of the combat is hand-to-hand with swords. The attack range is the same no matter which weapon you're holding, and the monsters you encounter don't really offer much challenge. Some of them might move slightly faster or may have a defense stance that you have to work around, but most of them just home directly towards you and swing as hard as they can. Taking them down one at a time was usually manageable, but it was always troublesome when there were too many foes on screen at once. Getting teamed up on brought about some hit detection weirdness from my character's sword swings. It seemed impossible to reliably hit more than one enemy at a time, so if I was getting cornered by a group, there was no way that I could swing fast enough to do them all in before they got me. If it wasn't for the money they dropped, I probably wouldn't have engaged in as much combat as I did. I tried my best to trigger one fight at a time, but honestly, sometimes I just ran away when the going got tough, since there's no real motivation to fight outside of a few bucks to fuel my livestock and e-geek purchases. I would be remiss if I didn't mention how silly the enemy sound effects are. No matter if you're fighting a bubble, a ghost, a ninja, or a knight, every single one of them makes the exact same noise when they take damage. It sounds like a muffled scream that would be better suited to something like Streets of Rage or Golden Axe. Even more mind-boggling was the death noise. All enemies, even bosses, yell like a chicken when they die. I don't know why they do, but they all do. These things, along with the Sonic the Hedgehog jumping sound effect, were hilarious to me. I was astonished at how out of place these felt, but also very tickled at the same time. In a game that was so careful about creating such a wonderful visual experience, as well as boasting a fantastic soundtrack through and through, these felt like they were added in as a joke. I'd love to pick the brain of the person who did this part of the programming to ask why a chicken caw was the best option for succumbing to the blade of our greedy hero. Anyway, I really appreciated the spacious inventory and how some of the healing items worked here. Those e-geeks I mentioned a while ago that Friday uses to revive Nigel act as lives of sorts. If you have 9 of them, you essentially have 9 lives to burn through before you get a game over, so they're definitely worth stocking up on before heading into a dungeon. The bulk of the adventure is actually spent working through maze-like dungeons. There are all sorts of obstacles that need overcoming, and while I'm usually not a huge puzzle platformer fan in 3D games, when they're isometric, I can't seem to get enough. I would say that out of all of the games I played in this style, Landstalker definitely had some of the highest expectations for perfection, but I revel in this kind of stuff. There are 2 things that this game achieves beautifully. The first is that you're taught basic maneuvers in a safe environment before you're expected to perform under pressure. Testing out some sneaky platforming or learning how to stack objects to reach higher ledges are some great examples of this that you see outside of a dungeon long before you ever see it inside of one. Secondly, the majority of problems you encounter can be solved without the need to shuffle through a massive inventory. There are some special items, particularly the boots that allow you to walk over certain surfaces that are necessary to proceed, but in terms of switch puzzles and opening up locked doors, you rarely need to think about anything more than what's in the room with you to conquer it. This also ties nicely into the first point I just mentioned, because as you get deeper into the game and the dungeons get longer, you'll be forced to innovate new solutions to the same kinds of problems as they evolve and become more complex as well. And if you do get stuck, the manual's actually packed with great suggestions on how to approach different puzzles you might run into. And generally speaking, I didn't get stuck too often. I barely even needed to write down any directions since the labyrinths were just labyrinthine enough to feel large, but not overwhelmingly so. I found a lot of the obstacles very creative, especially some of the timed rooms, and it was nice that there were multiple approaches to getting through them as well. One of my favorite parts about watching other people play Landstalker is seeing how they solve many of these rooms that made my brain start smoking while trying to figure them out for myself. No 2 playthroughs are anywhere near identical to one another, which says a lot about the brilliance behind the problem-solving design. If I could change one thing, it would have been the music in these areas. There's one tune that loops over and over again, and considering how much time you spend standing and thinking about how to proceed, having a couple of different dungeon tunes would have helped a lot. Running low on life and heading back into town to buy a couple of e-geeks was a great reason to take a break from the song, even if it was a pretty good one. It just wore out its welcome after too long. Now, when I say that I didn't get stuck in dungeons too often, there are a few exceptions worth mentioning. In general, I found the difficulty in Landstalker to be well-paced and manageable in a first-time playthrough, but there were 2 anomalous circumstances where the difficulty just shot straight through the roof and kept going all the way into space. One of them is this absolutely horrendous blue area. To me, a lot of the fun of platforming in isometric games is putting together where things are around you. It takes a lot of trial and error to figure out where platforms are relative to your character, and how to get onto them, especially when they're moving. There's nothing quite like the rush that comes from making a series of jumps that you had to plan out and execute flawlessly to reach a new part of a dungeon. Now, if you look at this room, you'll see that there's one really important element missing that totally breaks the learning process: the floor. The lack of a floor amplified what's already an extremely difficult scenario 100 times over. Whenever I missed a jump, I fell down several levels below, where I was slowly hacked apart by a ghost horde on my way back to the ladder to try again. I think I must have spent over an hour here, trying to string together the first few jumps to get to all the chests and doors in this room before I was able to move on to the next part of the dungeon. And a lot of that time was spent fighting my way back to the ladder in the rooms below, or retreating to town to buy more e-geeks since I was dying a lot from ghost assault. I would have given anything to be able to get right back into the action after missing a platform, but this room's design had cruel intentions. The final dungeon was another incredibly difficult track, but for different reasons than the one I just talked about. It did have some hard jumps to make, but its real challenge came from its sprawling mazy passages, timed puzzles, and how unforgiving some of the enemy combos could be. Looking back, I'm really not sure how I managed to get through it without mapping it out, but I guess after you spend a long enough time retracing your steps for hours on end, you do eventually learn the right way to go as a side effect. While it's nothing short of staggering in its execution, I also thought that the last area was a perfect culmination of everything you learned up until that point, and it served as a fantastic, albeit lengthy way to wrap up the game. Landstalker and all its trials easily make it one of the most gratifying experiences I've had on the Sega Genesis. As a whole, I loved it. It's demanding, clever, and has a wonderful way of pushing you to keep improving right up until the end. A stronger story and even remotely likable characters would have made this game an even more appealing one to my personal tastes, but the action and puzzling kept me engaged even in its absence. It's a testament of isometric problem solving at its finest, and if you're even a slight fan of games like this, I have no doubt that you'll appreciate this one too.